Welcome, everybody, to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's latest policy forum, hosted by the Institute's Reinhard Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence. Officials in the international community often assume that jihadist groups engaging in governance and statecraft are more moderate or seemingly pragmatic and less interested in violence than that once drove their movements. Yet recent events highlighted by Hamas's unprecedented attack on Israeli civilians 16 years after its transition into governance demonstrate a contrary reality, that jihadist groups often use their control of land and populations to recruit and finance violent attacks, while in some cases simultaneously striving for legitimacy. On January 10th, 2024, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy convened a workshop on jihadist governance and statecraft, the fifth in recent years to be organized by the Institute's Reinhard Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence on the subject area. This one-day strategy session, which included scholars, practitioners, and government officials, was operated according to Chatham House rule, was organized around three concepts encompassing Sunni and Shia jihadist governance. The first was, why do jihadists govern? Then the road from state capture to state building, and finally, contending with the challenges of jihadist governance. The output of this closed-door event was an edited volume consisting of 12 chapters organized around these three concepts, as you can see here. Today, we're joined by the editors of this volume, Dr. Devorah Margolin and Dr. Aaron Zellin, as well as two of the authors, Matthew Bambers-Ridd and myself. Today's panel will discuss the findings of the series as well as explore some of the case studies. Before I introduce the speakers, a bit of light housekeeping. Following introductory remarks from our speakers, we will open up to Q&A. If you would like to ask questions of our panelists during the event, please either enter them into the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or if you are watching this policy forum on our website or on YouTube, please feel free to email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Policy Forum, one word, at Washington Institute, also one word, .org. Let me quickly introduce our speakers. First, we will hear from Dr. Devorah Margolin, who is the Blumenstein Rosenblum Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. She is co-editor of the compilation Jihadi Governance and Statecraft and author of a chapter in the volume titled Retreating from Legitimacy, Hamas's Engagement in and Disengagement from Governance. Devorah will set the stage and provide a few examples from her chapter on Hamas. Dr. Matthew Bambers-Ridd is the advisor on armed groups at the International Committee of the Red Cross and a fellow at the Center on Conflict, Development, and Peacebuilding at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, Switzerland. He is the author of the chapter Humanitarian Engagement with Jihadist Groups. Matthew will explore one of the many challenges of jihadi governance, how NGOs engage with jihadi governing actors. And Dr. Aaron Zellin, who is the Gloria and Ken Levy Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute, where he put together the Islamic State Worldwide Activity Map project. Aaron is also a visiting research scholar in the Department of Politics at Brandeis University and founder of the website Jihadology. He is co-editor of this compilation, Jihadi Governance and Statecraft, and author of a chapter in the volume titled Looking for Legitimacy, the Taliban's Diplomacy Campaign. Aaron will conclude by exploring how some jihadi governing actors look for legitimacy, specifically the Taliban. So with no further ado, Devorah, I'd like to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. So when we were coming up with this project, we thought about how much our understanding of jihadi governments has really changed since 9/11. And today, the challenge is much broader and more complex, and it encompasses not just jihadi governance, but also statecraft and consolidations of power. And these jihadi groups are so diverse. They come from a variety of political, religious, and ideological backgrounds, and they participate in different forms and level of territorial control and governance. And that's why our compilation presents case studies from across the world to reflect this diversity. We have Hamas in the Palestinian arena, al-Shabaab in Somalia, al-Hashad al-Shabi in Iraq, Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, the Islamic State in multiple areas, including Syria, Iraq, and the Philippines, the Taliban in Afghanistan, JNIM in the Sahel, and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And due to this really diverse problem set, our policy solutions need to go beyond just military or financial solutions. And decision makers really need to address state bureaucracy, local economies, alliances, diplomacy, and even power competition among local, regional, and global actors. And as such, as we were looking at this problem set, we really wanted to divide this into three distinct questions. So why do jihadis govern? The second being the road from state capture to state building, how they get there to that state building project. And three was contending with the challenges once they are in jihadi governance. And this tripartite structure really facilitated a rich discussion and exploration of jihadi governance and statecraft and the threat it poses to the broader Middle East, as well as Western countries, including the United States. And through this strategy session and the compilation that followed, we came to 7 main findings. And each of these I'll try to tie in my chapter on Hamas, as well as the findings of the volume in general. The first of these findings is there's no uniform type of jihadist governance. Despite all falling under the umbrella of jihadi governance, the case studies really showcase this diversity of actors and governing models. But we did find that there were kind of 3 key factors that influence decision-making of these groups. It was the context, the competition, and the interpretation. And this in turn created a spectrum of implementation with some groups operating within existing political institutions, while others really sought to create their own. And when I think about this from the case that I explored, Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood-inspired group really focused on revolution from below, using the existing political structures and establishing social services to gain and maintain support, taking advantage of the frustrations with the seemingly corrupt Palestinian Authority in an already under-governed Palestinian arena. But after taking control and winning elections, taking part and winning elections, Hamas used the resulting deadly fighting to take control of Gaza by force in 2007. And so in the Hamas's entrance into governance, it was impacted by the local context, the competition in that institutional environment, and its interpretation of violent Islamist ideology. Our second finding is that almost all jihadist groups involved in governance really seek to control populations, apply their ideology, and extract resources. And this could be from creating or implementing laws or collecting taxes. These groups hope to use their governance in order to establish power, which they hope to attract personnel and facilitate stability and resilience. In Gaza, we saw Hamas assume control of pre-existing institutions. It continued to run social services. It even created new institutions, and that was all to control populations, apply their ideology, and really extract resources for their own goals. And just a small example, it's running of schools and camps to educate kids of the Hamas ideology in the hopes that one day they'll join the membership of the group and join perhaps the Al-Qassam Brigade. And yet almost all of the cases in our volume show that governance requires some sort of buy-in from populations being governed. Different groups use carrots or sticks, or sometimes both, to achieve this. And research has shown that there's a correlation between a population's buy-in and the success of that governing actor. And jihadist governing actors, like all governing actors, are in many ways thus accountable to local populations that they govern, even if it doesn't fit the way our own liberal democracy mindset thinks about it. And I think this is important because this is a weakness that policymakers can focus on. Our third finding was that the path from terrorist actor to governing actor is never a straight line nor one way. And I think in the post-October 7th environment, this one is very important. While some groups do leave violence behind completely in order to govern, others never turn away from that violence. And many groups, in fact, face a split within their leadership from more moderate elements who really do want to focus on governing and more radical elements who want to continue to carry out violence. And thus, despite that conventional wisdom that governance and statecraft are seemingly more pragmatic and may contain elements of advocating are seemingly more pragmatic, we actually might see that elements may contain a return to violence, and they could tread that path again. And I think about this in the Hamas case, where many assumed that governance would kind of moderate Hamas. The group would, focus on its governance and focus on its legitimacy, but instead it entrenched itself into a system of control, and it never relinquished its ultimate goal of destroying Israel. Hamas's leaders were even adamant after their election that participating in elections was not meaning a moderation of its position regarding the destruction of Israel. The fourth finding was that local institutions and context help to inform the decisions of jihadists. So a jihadist actor will operate in different ways based on local rivalries, as well as regional connections, transnational orientation, with such factors either encouraging or inhibiting types of violence. I think about Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, a Salafi jihadi aligned group that operates according to the ideology of Al-Qaeda. So the group is always going to operate with Al-Qaeda and the Salafi jihadi organizations in mind. And so understanding how that jihadist group does or does not operate in a vacuum is vital to creating this effective policy to counter it. Our fifth finding was that historical contexts and lessons learned can help determine the level of pragmatism espoused by these groups when it becomes a governing actor. So some of these groups discussed in our volume and during our strategy session governed for longer periods of time, some for shorter, and still others, like the Taliban, governed, lost power, and then regained power again. And so these historical contexts are extremely important for understanding how a group might move, its ability to be flexible or rigid, and its interpretation of its ideology. Our sixth finding was that jihadist governance does not emerge out of thin air. Most of the actors discussed in this volume were responding often to some sort of vacuum in their society. This could be lawlessness or undergovernance, such as with al-Shabaab in Somalia. It could be attempt to outcompete or outdemonstrate a cleaner, more corruption-free governance, such as Hamas against the Palestinian Authority. Or it could be the provision of services to outcompete and cement its position, such as we've seen with HTS in Syria. And finally, our seventh finding is one cannot disaggregate a group's underlying reason for existence from its day-to-day rule over a proto-state, semi-state, or a fully formed state. And I think this was the most provocative and also the essential question that came up during our strategy session and the resulting volume was that if jihadist government differs from day-to-day rule of other rebel groups of other ideologies. And while all the groups in this volume embrace jihad as a fundamental worldview, and when framing their fighting activities, their actual governance structure and behaviors do mirror that of non-jihadi groups. But the notion of whether jihadist governance even makes sense in the application of these groups' ideologies in their day-to-day foreign political activity, we argue that it does, that it's impossible to disaggregate a group's use of violence from its state-building project. And that would contradict the alignment of both its original and ultimate goals. And when I think about the case of Hamas, I think one of the weaknesses of the international community when looking at the group is it saw the state-building project, it saw the toned-down language, and it assumed that Hamas was moderating. But governance itself actually forced Hamas's hand into an ideological crisis. It was caught between governing and serving the needs of the Palestinian people in Gaza and its goal of violently destroying Israel. And it ultimately chose the latter. Overall, what we found in this volume is that every case of jihadist governance is unique, and it cannot be addressed in a one-size-fits-all solution. Each follows different modes of governance, different ideological interpretations, and different timelines. And yet, jihadist groups don't operate in isolation either. They instead are a product of their institutional environments. They learn from and are influenced by outside actors. And thus, we argue that lessons can be gleaned from their convergences and undermine their divergences. Thank you.
Super, Devorah. Thank you. Matthew, let's go to you.
Great, many thanks. So many thanks to Matthew, Devorah, and Aaron for the opportunity to join this panel today and to speak on the topic of humanitarian engagement with jihadist groups. In these brief remarks, I would kind of like to touch on three themes of why the International Committee of the Red Cross engages with jihadist groups, the challenges that we face in the engagement with jihadist groups, and how we try to overcome these challenges. So firstly, why does the ICRC engage with jihadi groups? So I'm sure as many of you are aware, the ICRC is an impartial, neutral, and independent organization that engages with all parties to an armed conflict to access the populations in need living in areas controlled by all parties to a conflict, which does include non-state armed groups. Persons living under the control of armed groups often face specific vulnerabilities and complex needs, and the ICRC estimates that as of June 2024, there are approximately 210 million persons who live under the full or contested territorial control of armed groups. In order to access this population, engagement with armed groups is therefore essential for the ICRC as we try to conduct our activities that alleviate and prevent the suffering of persons afflicted by armed conflict living in these areas. If we focus specifically at jihadi groups, the ICRC engages with jihadist armed groups on the same legal basis as it does with other non-state armed groups that are parties to a non-international armed conflict. There is no distinction in the obligations of a party's conflict to abide by international humanitarian law, whether they are a jihadist armed group or another type of non-state armed group. However, engagement with jihadist armed groups does represent a significant concern. This is primarily because jihadist groups represent a significant proportion of all armed groups of humanitarian concern worldwide, and they do come with their own set of specific engagement challenges, which the ICRC and other humanitarian organizations try to overcome. According to our own internal mapping of our engagement with armed groups, approximately 15% of all groups of humanitarian concern are affiliated with jihadist groups, and nearly a fifth of the total population that live under the control of armed groups are located in areas that are either fully controlled or contested by self-identified jihadist armed groups. Specifically, this represents approximately 40 million people who live under the control of jihadist armed groups. In particular, over the past couple of years, we have seen an expansion of jihadist armed groups such as Al-Qaeda and Islamic State into new areas in territory, particularly in the Sahel, which does create additional humanitarian needs and a larger population that perhaps needs to be protected and assisted by the ICRC or by other humanitarian organizations. So that's a general framing of why we engage with jihadist groups. And I just want to briefly talk about some of the specific challenges that we face with jihadi armed groups compared to other non-state armed groups that we engage with. So we can say that in general, the ICRC has slightly lower levels of contact with jihadi armed groups compared to other non-jihadi armed groups. In 2024, we successfully engaged with approximately 60% of jihadi armed groups worldwide. This engagement with jihadist armed groups is varied and ranges from engaging on operational dialogue to ensure the safe access for our teams, to the raising of protection concerns and the visiting of persons detained by these jihadist armed groups. So there's a wide range of dialogue and activities that we conduct within this engagement. Some of the main challenges that we face when engaging with jihadist armed groups is firstly, the jihadi group's own reluctance and ideological standpoint on humanitarian organizations. So in general, when we look at the whole plethora of non-state armed groups worldwide, we find that most armed groups are willing to engage with the ICRC. Most of the obstacles that we face do not come from the armed groups themselves. This is slightly different for jihadi groups, however, where we find that almost half of jihadi armed groups are reluctant to speak to us. This reluctance is caused by a variety of reasons, which includes perhaps ideological distrust of the ICRC, as well as other humanitarian organizations. Potentially, humanitarian organizations are often portrayed and viewed by jihadist organizations as being Western entities, potentially engaged in espionage activities, and potentially complicit with the states with whom they are often in conflict. And of course, this can have, as a consequence of this reluctance, some jihadi groups do not allow humanitarian organizations to enter their territory, and they condone or prevent the persons living under their control to accept the aid and assistance provided by these organizations. This viewpoint, however, it's important to note, is not identical amongst all jihadi groups, and we face different degrees of reluctance. And different groups affiliated to the same central jihadist organization can have very divergent opinions on engagement with the ICRC and other humanitarian organizations. And we find that this divergence reflects the importance of local dynamics on jihadi groups, who often choose to engage with humanitarian actors for their own reasons, even if it potentially contradicts the decisions or judgments taken by the central jihadi leadership. So that's one challenge that we face. Another one is, as you can imagine, many jihadi groups are involved in active armed conflict and they have unstable territorial control. So we suppose that a jihadist armed group is willing to engage with the ICRC. In that case, however, they are frequently involved in armed conflict with necessarily shifting lines of territorial control and frequent changes of leadership, which makes the sustained engagement that is necessary for assisting in areas controlled by armed groups exceptionally challenging for us as humanitarian actors. As we find with other types of non-jihadist armed groups, the ICRC in general has greater success with those jihadi groups that have sustained territorial control over an area and engage in some type of governance activity, whether that is the distribution of social services, the provision of education, the provision of healthcare, or the establishment of dispute resolution mechanisms. The provision of some type of governance services is the most significant indicator of success with a jihadi group, often because it is a byword for the ability for us to have more time as an organization to build the necessary sustained relationships that are required to negotiate humanitarian access with a jihadi group. And the third challenge that I'll speak about today is the obstacles that we face from states when we try to engage with jihadist groups. State-imposed obstacles negatively impact engagement with approximately more than 80% of jihadi armed groups worldwide. Despite their potential international legal obligations, many states can try and prevent the ICRC from fulfilling its mandate and gaining access to areas controlled by jihadi groups or to the actual groups themselves. This is for a myriad of different potential reasons on the state side, including potential distrust of the ICRC or not willing to give perceived legitimacy to a jihadist actor operating within their territory. The increase of counterterrorism legislation at both the domestic level in which the jihadi group operates and international legislation can further complicate this, acting potentially as a significant legal obstacle for both the ICRC to engage with the listed groups and to provide aid in specific areas. As a consequence, the ICRC and other humanitarian organizations work with states to try and protect and strengthen the humanitarian space and to convince authorities to enable ICRC engagement with armed groups on their territory. This includes working on including humanitarian exemptions in counterterrorism legislation that does not criminalize either the engagement with armed groups or the actual support that ICRC provides to populations living under the control of armed groups. The recent UN Security Council Resolution 2664, which does allow humanitarian exemptions in asset freeze measures, is a potentially significant victory in reducing this challenge and obstacle to engagement with jihadist groups. So those are three challenges that we face with jihadist groups. And now I just want to speak briefly about how we overcome some of these challenges. So firstly, I would just like to say engagement with jihadi groups is challenging, but not impossible, which is reflected in the ICRC's ability to engage with approximately 60% of jihadist armed groups this year. Many of the approaches that we as the ICRC take to engagement with jihadist groups are similar to those that we take with other armed groups. However, there are two distinct approaches to engagement with jihadist armed groups that are worth highlighting and are an indicator of our successful engagement with groups. Firstly is that the International Committee of the Red Cross has invested significantly in engaging in dialogue with Islamic religious circles to explore and build bridges between Islamic law and international humanitarian law. This building of bridges shows the complementarity of these two traditions on both operational and protection issues, which includes but not limited to issues such as restraint in fighting and the protection of detainees. The ICRC, by building bridges between Islamic law, is therefore able to speak to jihadi groups and influential persons in a way that is more relevant to their motives and experience, rather than through a purely IHL-only outreach and dissemination approach, which might not be perceived as favorably. And the second aspect I'd like to focus on is the importance, and I think Devorah mentioned it before, is of the local dynamics when engaging with armed groups. We find that local dynamics remain exceptionally important when engaging with jihadi armed groups. We have seen increased localization of jihadi armed groups, whether they are affiliated with Al-Qaeda or Islamic State, whereby local factors play a more significant role in the potential for engagement compared to the role of centrally mandated decisions from a jihadist hierarchy. In particular, due to the sustained engagement of the ICRC over decades in front lines where jihadist groups are active, members of local jihadi groups often have prior experience with the ICRC or other humanitarian organizations, which can help facilitate our engagement with these groups at the local level. And I'll just finally say that this shows the kind of fundamental necessity of humanitarian organizations being given safe, sustained access to the areas where these groups operate to protect and assist the populations living under their control. Thank you very much.
Super. Thank you, Matthew. Aaron.
Thank you so much, and hope everybody's having a good day so far. I just wanted to thank Devora for working with me on this edited volume. I think it's a really interesting and important topic that will continue to resonate, I think, in policy circles, as well as how people view a lot of different parts of the world in, the years to come, if not the next 2 decades or so, if not longer. So, I think a lot of discussion of jihadi groups in the past has focused on specifically the governance aspect of the title of the volume, insofar as them, dealing with social services and more related to the local populations. But one thing that I've noticed in my research in recent years is that increasingly there's also sort of a foreign policy of these actors as they've matured over time. So while I'm talking about the case of the Taliban today, I think I should note that I also recently wrote an article related to Hamas's diplomatic efforts, especially after the October 7th attacks, and that we've seen that in the almost a year after the 10/7 attacks, they've had 5-fold amount of diplomatic engagements than the year prior to that. So it's something to look at with regard to these groups, especially when we think about the future of other groups that control territory or could control territory, whether it's HTS in Northwest Syria or maybe possibly JNM in the Sahel region, and what that could mean in terms of engagement vis-a-vis these organizations within the international system. So unlike in the prior 2 decades, when the Taliban's power derived from its insurgency and armed forces, the group is now making greater use of a key instrument of the state, diplomacy. This is a natural continuation in many ways of the negotiating skills it garnered while working out its 2020 peace and withdrawal agreement with the United States during its meetings in Qatar. It also is an underappreciated aspect of statecraft that lends more credence to jihadist actors within the international system, even if there remains some level of skepticism. It is a tool that the Taliban has now used to showcase that it is willing to have dialogue with a variety of world actors without actually changing its own authoritarian and theocratic rule within Afghanistan locally by relying on diplomatic style speak to cover for inadequacies in areas of concern, such as women's rights and roles within society, among other issues. Since the Taliban took over Kabul in August 2021, the group has sought international recognition for its Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is the official name of its government. When Taliban forces first held the country from 1996 to 2001, only at the time Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates recognized their rule. Today, we haven't seen any government officially do this thus far, yet while no country has officially recognized the new government, the Taliban is far less isolated, I'd argue now, than it was during that first iteration of its so-called Islamic Emirate. Similar to other states, the Islamic Emirate has regularly promoted its meetings with foreign officials since it took power in mid-August 2021, using official government websites and local media websites, as well as its own Twitter accounts. And these encounters have covered a wide range of issues, including humanitarian aid, governance assistance, economic opportunities, industrial investment, and religious exchanges, among other things. In other words, despite not being sort of de jure recognized by countries or the international community, the Taliban is more or less de facto recognized. Its Islamic Emirate has steadily acknowledged via numerous non-committal acts. Additionally, a number of countries have since called for the Islamic Emirates' international recognition, even though they themselves have not done so themselves. In March 2022, for example, the Turkish foreign minister at the time called for international recognition of the Islamic Emirate, while Malaysia's special representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Afghanistan in July 2022 said the same thing. Likewise, in March 2022, Russia's foreign minister argued that the group should be granted a seat at the United Nations. So while they themselves haven't officially recognized it. It's something that's been discussed now for a couple of years already. So as of last week, or September 9th, the Taliban has publicly announced 1,988 diplomatic meetings now with at least 92 countries. I imagine 9 days later now, it's plausible that they've now surpassed the 2,000 engagement mark, which is quite large, considering the fact that each year since the Taliban has taken power, it's exponentially grown. And just to give some context, the top 10 countries that they've engaged with over that time has been China, Turkey, Iran, Qatar, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Russia, Japan, and Malaysia. As for the West, the European Union has engaged the Taliban the most, and only the EU, the United Kingdom, and Norway have really met the Taliban in Afghanistan itself. The rest have been in Qatar. Although most of the Taliban's diplomatic meetings have taken place in Kabul, the second most used venue has been Doha in Qatar. This is not necessarily surprising, since Qatar developed close relations with the Taliban due to Doha's role in facilitating the U.S.'s withdrawal agreement from Afghanistan. Doha has served two purposes for the Islamic Emirates' legitimacy efforts. First, it has been where Western nations can engage the new government more comfortably without granting it as much legitimacy as going to Afghanistan itself. And second, and more importantly, from a broader legitimacy building perspective, Doha has provided a platform for the Taliban to ingratiate itself with many other countries' local embassies in a way not possible in other countries or within its own, most notably through Independence Day or other national celebrations of these various countries. And I should say about 20% of the countries engaging the Taliban have done so due to these diplomatic niceties within the context of Qatar. And therefore, they've in many ways helped normalize the Taliban's Islamic Emirate within a broader swath of the international community. And now, more recently, especially in the last year, less than a year, we see a similar scenario play out within Malaysia and Kuala Lumpur, though it's still at the smaller scale than in Doha, but it's an interesting venue for them to try and engage more countries in Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific than they would have otherwise. Taliban engagement has also expanded through attendance at multilateral forums, which also shows the leadership's greater integration into the international system and the various diplomatic venues where countries engage. So far, they've attended a number of forums in China, such as the Tungsi Neighboring Countries Meeting, China-South Asia Cooperation Forum, Trans-Himalayan Forum, China's Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation. You also see them engaging in Russia's Kazan Forum and Astrakhan Forum, Qatar's Qatar Economic Forum and Doha Forum, Turkey's Antalya Diplomatic Forum, and Uzbekistan's Tashkent International Conference. The Taliban is also closely met with and worked with now both the Saudi Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the Qatar Union of Muslim Scholars, illustrating its deepening ties within international Islamic entities. These engagements have led the Taliban's Islamic Emirate to devise its own forum, actually, that debuted this year in late January, which they call Afghanistan's Regional Cooperation Initiative. And at least thus far this year, it included China, India, Indonesia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, Russia, Turkey, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. According to Taliban officials, quote, the meeting was mainly aimed at discussions and talks on establishing a region-centric narrative aimed at developing regional cooperation for a positive and constructive engagement between Afghanistan and regional countries. The Taliban's various diplomatic efforts have led to more countries reopening their embassies in Kabul, while also allowing the Islamic Emirate to have varying presences at embassies and diplomatic missions abroad. However, unevenly, this has been thus far. 21 countries or entities have reopened their embassies in Kabul since the Taliban's retakeover of Afghanistan. We have Azerbaijan, China, the EU, India, Indonesia, Iran, Japan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Malaysia, Oman, which was just announced, I think, 2 days ago now, Pakistan, Qatar, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Tajikistan, Turkey, Turkmenistan, United Arab Emirates, and Uzbekistan. The only two countries, however, that have recognized the Islamic Emirate as the legitimate successor of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and have accredited a Taliban-appointed ambassador have been China and the United Arab Emirates. the latter coming within the last month or so. Though Uzbekistan, in recent meetings with the Taliban, noted that they were hoping to plan to accredit the Taliban's ambassador very soon as well. That being said, the Taliban employees for embassy chargé d'affaires have been accredited by Iran, Kazakhstan, Pakistan, Russia, and Turkmenistan, as well as Qatar thus far. Of course, a lot of these meetings have discussed many issues. One thing to highlight, sort of a success from the perspective of the Taliban, I think, was the recent announcement of them inaugurating the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline that they've been working on diplomatically over the last 3+ years now to get online, an effort that it goes back all the way to the 1990s when this, the acronym it being the TAPI pipeline was first discussed as a possibility for regional integration on energy issues. And it's finally now starting to be built to sort of connect those 4 countries together. And therefore, the Islamic Emirates' diplomatic efforts have allowed for a level of normalization within an international system, even though it is yet to provide basic rights to women or to grapple with its past and current support for other jihadist actors internationally, whether it's with Al-Qaeda or regionally with the Tariq Taliban Pakistan. Thus, while fighting may have helped the Islamic Emirate win its country back, diplomacy has allowed it to be an accepted international actor, even if it remains to be recognized officially. Thank you.
Wow, fantastic presentations. Again, I want to remind everybody, this is all based on the incredible volume that Aaron and Devora edited, that Matthew and I and a whole bunch of others were privileged to contribute to. It is also available as a PDF to download for free from our website. So lots of moderators will start off kind of at 80,000 feet and then go down. I'm going to throw you straight into the lion's den, if I may. We'll go in reverse order. Aaron, you gave us a really great picture of the extent to which the Taliban is seeking legitimacy abroad. I'm wondering how some of its policies undermine its legitimacy at home and also potentially its efforts abroad. So take, for example, the fact that the Taliban recently banned a UN polio vaccination campaign, which is obviously in the public health interests of its people. Does that have an impact on the Taliban's position internationally? Does it have an impact on the Taliban's legitimacy at home?
Well, I think, it's obviously difficult to pull everybody within Afghanistan. Of course, I would imagine that a good portion of women within the country are not happy with the devolution of their rights over the last 3+ years, where they're more or less second-class citizens at best, if not worse. However, because they do essentially have a security state now, they're able to clamp down on sort of any protests against them. We also saw, of course, after they took over the country, many individuals fled that were related to the original or to the Afghan Republic that was in power for about 20 years after the US invasion post 9/11. But what's interesting, one of the things that I thought might have affected sort of the Taliban originally was almost a year after they took power in July 2022, when the U.S. conducted a drone strike against Ayman al-Zawahiri, killing the leader of Al-Qaeda. And it was a question I had at the time, whether this might affect sort of the trajectory of their international engagement, but it only, there was sort of a slight downturn that August, but then the trajectory continued back up, and it's only been exponential in many ways ever since. So while it's true that there might be this issue related to polio, I imagine that there are other issues that the UN continues to want to work with the Taliban and its Islamic Emirate on locally. You see them meeting with the UN all the time. And the thing is that just like in the context of any other country and diplomacy, there are things that certain countries don't necessarily like about one another, but they still want to engage on specific issues where they might have interests that align, especially economic interests. And it's important to note that while, Afghanistan might not have the most resources in the world, because of the fact that it's more or less been in a war environment going back to the late 1970s, early 1980s, which is, almost 50 years now, there's a lot of potential resources that a lot of people want to extract from the country, whether to benefit their own country or to provide benefit locally to Afghanistan. So I think that while there might be, these issues that many in the West will see as negative because of the fact that there are all these other things that could potentially be seen as positive from a country's perspective, especially those that are authoritarian themselves and don't necessarily care about, equal rights to citizens or women's rights or anything else along those lines. I believe that'll continue to garner more and more engagement over time.
Matthew, you gave a really fascinating presentation explaining the ICRC's mandate and its need to try and provide life-saving humanitarian need wherever it is needed, regardless of who happens to be governing. And you mentioned that there are states that kind of put barriers in the way. UN Security Council Resolution 2664 paves a road for what and how to do. It's telling that was co-sponsored by the United States. The United States is one of those countries that puts impediments perhaps in ICRC's way. My question to you flips things a little bit. What type of measures does the ICRC take to mitigate the ability of armed groups, in this case specifically jihadi armed groups, from benefiting, whether it's materially or economically, from the support that the ICRC provides to people in areas they control, whether it's in kind of, having to pay for security, access to roads, what type of mitigation does the ICRC engage in to kind of address the fact that you're operating in areas that are controlled by dangerous militant groups?
Thanks very much, Matthew. That's a very important question. We do take mitigation. I cannot go into kind of any specifics that we do in our engagement with armed groups. As you can understand, we have a confidential dialogue with armed groups, and necessarily our activities are conducted as an impartial, independent, neutral organization. However, we do take these type of measures to ensure that any material assistance or supported to is provided to the armed group living under a population of control of armed groups. And we engage with all parties of the armed conflict, whether states or non-state armed groups, to ensure that we get that fundamental access that is required to ensure that we have the ability to kind of protect and assist the populations living under the control of armed groups.
Super. Devorah, at one point you talked about how jihadist governance doesn't appear out of thin air. But we also talked, there was 16, 17 years of Hamas control of the Gaza Strip before there was October 7th. And I wonder if there's concern about, from a policy perspective, which is why I'm asking you, not Matthew, not from the aid provision perspective, from a policy perspective of doing things, whether it's aid or engagement, tolerating the financial activities, which was largely the subject of my chapter on Hezbollah's activities in Lebanon, that perpetuates the ability of, in this case, jihadi armed groups to continue to engage in governance of the type that we saw over those 16 to 17 years in the Gaza Strip?
I think that's a good question. I'll answer, but also pivot and go a little broader, if that's okay. I think
Very experienced to you, yes.
One of the things that we often talk about is how these groups are able to emerge in these, it doesn't appear out of thin air. They're emerging in under-governed or alternatively governed spaces. And we don't often want to talk about this under governance because it is hard work and it's not popular, and it unfortunately is very complicated and messy. It's why we have a whole section on contending with the challenges, right? It isn't just that these groups want to govern and that they do govern, but really what happens after they are starting to govern? How do we ensure that we don't ignore the humanitarian part of this, be it in Gaza, be it in Northeast Syria, be it in the Sahel, where there are populations that need aid or vaccines or other things. And so it's really important. So policymakers have to think not just military solutions and financial solutions, but they really have to think about state bureaucracy, local economies, alliances, diplomacy, and really that competition at local, regional, and global levels in order to kind of create a more holistic policy, thinking about the implications, right? And I really do think that the interesting thing we saw was that in Gaza today, the UN has had a very difficult time getting aid to people who need to get it in Gaza. That being said, the UN just ran an extremely successful vaccination campaign where it vaccinated 90% of children under the age of 10. And so I think it shows that, it can happen. And when priorities need to be in place, it also shows that Hamas is still governing in Gaza in many ways. It's allowing the aid to get in. And so it just shows the complexities of this whole process and that we need to think beyond military and financial solutions.
So Aaron, when you and Dev put this project together, you decided to organize this around three concepts. Why did jihadists govern? The road from state capture to state building, and contending with the challenges of jihadist governance. Give us a sense of why these were the three baskets you decided to build the book around.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very valid question. Obviously, we have a lot of different case studies that we could potentially do. And, one way of doing it could have been, more about different regions. But we felt when we were really thinking it through that thematically, it made most sense to first sort of provide a background why these groups want to govern, and helping do that through a number of case studies on that, and showing the range of that in many respects. Then, through providing sort of examples in a number of other case studies, looking at how they then go from, the idea of wanting to govern to trying to sort of implement it at various levels, of course. It then helps contextualize how, while there are similarities, there are also a lot of differences, as Devorah talked about in her opening remarks, whether it's, the local contexts or the variations in ideologies and so on and so forth. And then finally, once we sort of, provided, these examples and answers about, how this is happening, it made most sense then to provide sort of like, okay, well, what can be done about this? Because of course, from, an American perspective or a Western perspective, these states or, proto-states or however you want to describe it, can be a challenge to the interests of U.S. allies in the regions where these groups or states operate, or they, challenge, using violence, the United States and its allies as well. So, sort of putting that all together then provides sort of the life cycle in some ways of this whole issue. And we tried to really use case studies in many ways that were different from one another in terms of groups, but also in terms of regions. I mean, this expands all the way from Africa to Southeast Asia. And it spans from, groups that are more nationally focused to those that have both local, regional, transnational focuses. And then we also, a lot of the focus when you hear about jihadists is usually on Sunni groups. But the reality is that, when you look at these Shia groups that are primarily sponsored by Iran, they use jihad to derive a lot of their legitimacy in the way that they frame issues. So, for example, when Hezbollah is announcing somebody died as a martyr, they say that he died doing his jihadi duties. So, like, yes, while much of the conventional wisdom or the way that it's framed is that, jihadi actors are, these Sunnis in Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and other groups. But the reality is we can't separate that from these Shia extremists and militant groups as well.
Matthew, one of the impediments I imagine that you guys have to deal with is working in areas that are controlled by groups that are designated as terrorists in one way or another, and then the legal requirements or impediments that brings. There's current debate, like literally yesterday, today, here in Washington, ongoing about whether the Houthis in Yemen should be designated as a foreign terrorist organization. And the primary argument against it being made largely by the State Department is that it would make it much more difficult for international aid organizations to do the life-saving work that they need to do in Yemen. But there are other places, many other places, where the international community, and I'm not asking specifically about the ICRC here, more generally, is able, perhaps with difficulty, but able to work in spaces that are controlled by groups that are designated, including groups that are designated as FTOs. So how big of an impediment is that? And again, without getting into confidential engagements, whatever, what types of steps can be taken to find ways to navigate that, continue to provide the aid that is needed where it's needed, even as counterterrorism measures are put in place to address the jihadi groups that are in power?
Yeah, many thanks for that. Yeah, I can't comment on specifically on the FTO designation of the Houthis in America now, but I can talk about generally about the issue of what is required from the state side. From our side, the most important thing is to have sufficient amount of humanitarian exemptions that allow humanitarian organizations to be able to go in and access the populations without it having kind of any freezing or impediment effect on both our ability to engage in activities to support the population there, or to engage with the groups directly if that is required. 2664 is a great step forward in there, and particularly related to asset freeze and sanction measures, but it doesn't cover all conflicts and it doesn't cover all types of sanctions or potential counterterrorism regimes. So we need to have that general exemption there. What we have also found is that in general, there has been a reduction of the humanitarian space in legislation and the ability of humanitarian organizations to be able to operate in a safe, secure manner and to be able to access the populations that require it the most. And it is really that kind of humanitarian space that we need to deliver the essential activities that we do. But tie that into your earlier question about kind of like aid diversion and the steps that we take. We have very robust processes and very rigid systems in place to ensure that we speak to all sides and all sides trust us as a neutral and humanitarian actor. So, for example, when we distribute medical supplies, we distribute those to ourselves as the ICRC or together with our partners so that we see where those items go first. And we conduct very significant assessments before we go into an area to ensure that the necessary steps are there to ensure that the people who receive the need are the persons that do that. So we ask and we work with states all the time to increase the humanitarian space for us to be able to deliver those kind of life-saving activities that we conduct in areas controlled by armed groups, whether they are jihadist or not.
So believe it or not, the sign of a fascinating conversation is we're already in our last few minutes here. And so I'm going to combine a few questions together that have come in. Devora, when it comes to a group like Hamas, and your contribution was on Hamas, that has demonstrated a lack of concern about its population and demonstrated a willingness to engage in behaviors that it knows will be very costly to the local population. Is there not an argument to be made that in some ways it's more humane not to do things that will perpetuate that group's ability to govern? How do we balance the need to be able to provide aid that people need to get by day to day on the one hand, with on the other hand, the knowledge that we're dealing with groups that A, don't really care about their local populations, and B, if you look at the way Hamas was able to fool the Israelis and everybody else about their real intentions and about how committed they were to governance, that whether it's governments or humanitarian organizations engaging in confidential engagements with these organizations, that they're not always going to be truthful about what they're actually trying to do. Is there not something to be said for trying to balance these two needs, to help people get by day to day with the need they need, but not to provide so much aid as to be able to benefit a group and perpetuate their rule?
I think it's an important and hard question. I think looking at the way that Hamas used the aid they received over an extended period in time of its governance, over the 16 years that it governed territory in Gaza, was that we saw a gross misuse of that aid, unfortunately. the ability to build the tunnel systems that they have created a huge acknowledgement that Hamas was taking the aid that they were supposed to be using to build schools, hospitals, and other things in order to entrench themselves in Gaza and to use it as a launch pad against Israel. Unfortunately, though, that being said, the priority should always be on humanitarian aid. We should never be in a situation where we are creating a situation where people are starving and dying. When we think about radicalization, when we think about how groups are able to recruit people, it's based on often two kind of things. It is based on these underlying root causes that turn people towards a new ideology. So those push factors, and they can be very, very different. It can be hunger, it can be grievances or perceived grievances or many other factors, but it's also the pull factors of the ideology, and Hamas being allowed to be the actor that is there, that is pulling in. And so what needs to really happen is we cannot stop giving aid. That is not an option. What we need to do is undermine Hamas's governance. And so I think that is how we need to approach it when we're contending with this challenge of jihadist governance. It does not mean ignore the populations that are living under these groups, but rather it means that we need to be engaging directly in undermining these groups' ability to govern successfully.
So, Aaron, at the end of the day, if you look at the Taliban, if you look now at Hamas, at your more recent paper that you referenced, we're dealing with two groups that did not dilute their commitment to militancy, nor to hardline ideology, but appear to have been able, nonetheless, to resurrect their international contacts. Does that actually suggest legitimacy? Does it suggest that, maybe the world still doesn't like these groups, but they recognize a need to work with them, much as Matthew was talking about? They're there. There are people living under their thumb. You got to engage with them to be able to get what you got to get done. At the end of the day, what does it actually mean to a policymaker that the Taliban re-governing Afghanistan, Hamas, even after October 7th and 11 plus months of severe violence, are able to get meetings in all these different places?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think it's important to also note that there's a big difference between the level of engagement that the Taliban has been able to do versus Hamas, where the Taliban has been able to engage, I think, more than 90 countries, where Hamas has only been able to engage about 25 or so, maybe. As well as the rate is much higher for the Taliban. And I think part of that is due to the different levels of legitimacy or perceived legitimacy, where the Taliban controls all of Afghanistan and is seen as the ruler of Afghanistan, even if people sort of disagree with the fact that they're the ruler, whereas Hamas, of course, only controls Gaza. And there's, of course, the Palestinian Authority as what is seen as more the internationally recognized government of the Palestinians. I think a lot of it comes down to realism of people from a ideological perspective thinking. Like, there are natural resources in Afghanistan and I want to get them. We can engage this country and this could potentially hurt an adversary. And then other times people just agree with them. I mean, obviously, a country like Iran engaging Hamas makes sense because they're aligned together. So I think a lot of it comes down to countries saying that this is a fait accompli, essentially, and that, so long as we could potentially get something out of it for ourselves, we might as well do something. I mean, one of the interesting things going on now, I think, is that there's sort of this policy debate, not in the United States, but in the United Kingdom, about engaging the Taliban more and how to do that. I don't think that they have come up with an answer or solution yet. But if they do, they'd be a huge mover from sort of the Western perspective, since, as I noted, most Western countries have tried to limit any engagements, as well as the fact that whenever they do, a lot of the times it's usually in multilateral forums and primarily in Doha instead of going to Kabul. But if the UK is a first mover on this, this could then change the perception of other countries and therefore further sort of normalize the acceptance of the Taliban, even though it really hasn't changed all that much The only difference now is that they have a lot better public affairs and propaganda to push it forward than they did, 20 years ago.
All right. Devorah, I'm going to let you close this out with one big question. So you argued at one point in this volume that there's no uniform type of jihadist governance. So bottom line, without going to different examples, why does that matter for policymakers? Like, does that make a difference from a policy perspective?
It does. And I will reiterate what I said. It matters the context, local context in which these groups are operating, the kind of competition. Are they competing against a state actor or non-state actor? And their interpretation of ideology. Are they a Sunni or Shia group? Are they a Salafi jihadi or a Muslim Brotherhood inspired group? All of these are vital for when we create good policy to create, for policymakers to think about when they create measures to counter these groups.
This is a hugely consequential, extremely complicated issue. And I'd argue the only really way to understand it is to read the book. So I want to thank Aaron and Devorah and all the contributors right now, in particular Matthew, for putting this together. I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen to us today. For more information, check out washingtoninstitute.org. In the meantime, everybody be safe and have a good day. Thank you all.